Lula's lost a battle, but insists he'll win the war. Brazil's charismatic former president vowing to fight on after appellate judges upheld his bribery conviction. He's got other cases pending. Polls show that even with those other legal cases, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva remains the clear frontrunner in the race for president. The Workers' Party endorsing him to run in October. Will he be allowed to stand? Is he the best Brazil can come up with in these times of recession and scandal? It's not just Lula, but politicians from across the spectrum that stand accused of taking bribes as part of Operation Lavo Jato, or Operation Car Wash. At the heart of it, construction firm Odebrecht, whose kickbacks extended everywhere from Mexico to Argentina. What does the scandal say about Brazil, the continent, and its fledgling democracies? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the issue of whether it'll be prison or the presidency for Lula. And with us, Luis Felipe de Alencastro, who teaches history at the Sao Paulo School of Economics. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
We welcome back attorney Fernando Santiago, based here in the French capital. Nice to see you.
My pleasure.
We're also with Indy Landaro, former Wall Street Journal correspondent in Latin America. Happy New Year.
Good evening.
And from Geneva, Jamil Chad, correspondent for daily newspaper Estado de Sao Paulo, and the author of Politics, Bribes, and Football. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. Yeah, let's start with the latest. The Workers' Party confirming the nomination of its founder. Lula will be candidate in next October's presidential vote. This despite losing an appeal on his conviction. In fact, the sentence extended. But of course, there'll be more on the legal proceedings. The PT and its leader making that setback almost sound like a victory. Solange Mougin has more.
Comparing himself to a political prisoner, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva said nothing will stop his presidential hopes. Defiantly before a crowd of thousands, he said his latest conviction of corruption will not keep his name off the presidential ballot.
Nelson Mandela was in prison for 27 years. But his fight did not decrease because of that. He returned and became president of South Africa.
Lula has maintained his innocence since being convicted last year of receiving a seaside apartment as a kickback for doling out contracts to the state oil company Petrobras. But Wednesday's appeal verdict is a blow to the 72-year-old's plans to run for president again. Because under Brazil's clean slate laws, a conviction makes him ineligible to run. The three-judge panel unanimously upheld the lower court's decision and added jail time, bringing it to over 12 years. Lula has vowed to continue fighting the verdict and the 6 other corruption cases against him, much to the joy of his supporters.
We are taking to the streets because we want to defend Lula tooth and nail.
The court's decision, though, was a breath of fresh air at this anti-corruption rally.
We're thirsty for justice. We need punishment. Those who steal in this country must be punished.
A polarizing figure in Brazil, Lula has been polling well, with over 30% of Brazilians saying they'd vote for him next October. But with more appeals ahead, he may be facing an uphill battle.
Let me give you, Jamil Chade, how's it looking for Lula? Because our correspondent was saying how it's a big legal setback, no doubt about it, but it's actually could give him more political traction, this decision.
Well, in fact, that is true. Actually, he just said a couple of minutes ago that he has no reason to respect the decision. This is clearly pointing out that, yes, he will continue in the fight. He also is planning, as of next month, a number of rallies around the country with thematic issues to be dealt with. So, meaning he's actually in campaign. He's also traveling this coming Friday, tomorrow, to Ethiopia to a meeting. So actually he has an agenda, he has a plan. Obviously the question is whether this will go forward, up to what point. Now, yes, he has a plan, and this this defying element will actually be very essential, actually will define mostly the campaign of this year.
Yeah, and of course, as you say, the question is whether or not he'll be allowed to run. Should he be allowed to run? Luis Felipe de Alencastro.
I guess there's 3 points. First, the political future of Lula himself. Second, of his leadership. It's not the same thing, because even in jail, he will have a very strong leadership. And he could support the candidate of the Workers' Party. And third, the future of the Workers' Party itself, because it's in October there are general elections to the chamber also, and Senate, part of the Senate. So the party will be.
Let's pick up on that. Let's pick up on that second point, because I think it's important. If he does wind up going to jail, he could still sort of transfer, if I understand correctly,
yes,
the nomination on the ballot and have his party stay on the ballot.
Yes, that's why he said today he is still campaigning. He has to campaign until the door of the jail. I mean, because even if he has a virtual presence in the campaign, which will be important because he can indicate another candidate. There are 2 names from the Worker Party, and so he will be able to have some interference in the election.
All right. How strong is the case against him? Because his supporters and some international observers are saying that the case on this particular charge relating to that apartment, which he claims he never stayed in, is weak.
Well, we have to remember that he was sentenced to 9 years by first instance judge, and then the Superior Court now raises the time on imprisonment to 12 years and 1 month, and there are 3 judges, 3 different judges. So I can say that the case shall be strong otherwise, and the decision was unanimous. So one of the judges at least would have some doubts on that, and they could vote differently, but they did not. So all the 3 vote on the same phase, on the same voice, on the same. So I think that the case is pretty much strong.
The case is strong for you. He's going to jail.
Well, that's another question and a different one. One of them is the case is strong, yes, but he can challenge that decision. He had more legal things on his hand to do.
Inti Landau, what to make of him?
I think it's natural for Lula to present himself as a victim of a system, but let's not forget that he was president for 8 years and controlled the systems for many years. So it is kind of. And his party kept on controlling the system for several years after he left power. So depicting himself as an outsider is being persecuted by an oligarchy or by the power or by a system is kind of weak. I mean, he used to control everything.
Hang on, you say it's weak, but we can call up the polling numbers, and the latest polls date back from December, and pollsters this Thursday saying that this latest decision could even give him a boost in the polls, and he was already way ahead of the rest of the field. There you see, it's he's on 36%, and you see there the presumed candidate from the ruling party is not even in second place there. What do you make of the numbers we see from this poll, which dates back to
I think popularity of a politician doesn't say much about his potential guilt in a graft lawsuit.
Sure.
The fact that he's popular doesn't change much about the strength of the case against him.
He's not being judged because he controlled everything for 7 years. He's being judged because he's supposed to be the owner of a flat, and there's no proof on it.
Of course, no. I'm not saying. I'm just saying that he's showing himself as a victim of a system he may be, there may be political interference in the case against him, but he cannot just say that there's nothing against him.
Luis Felipe de Alencastro, you heard there Fernando Santiago say, yeah, all right, the case can seem weak to some, but the sentence was stiffened by the appellate court.
Yes, they did it I mean, that's the opinion of Governor Flavio Dino, who is a very important judge, also is the governor of Maranhão. And he said that the penalty was to raise it because they could, like that, avoid prescription. That was completely prepared before. By the way, all the lawyers that were there noted that the three judges had already wrote before all their interventions, and you see they did listen, either the lawyer or the prosecutor. They did change. They have already wrote their decision before. That's very odd.
All right, so
in Europe.
The argument is on over how impartial the judges were. Let's listen to Brazil's current president. The center writes, Michel Temer. He so far is not running. From the World Economic Forum in Davos, he hailed Tuesday's court decision.
I think corruption is a natural topic of discussion. There's a hard, ongoing fight against corruption in the country. But the main answer to your question is the revelation that in Brazil, institutions are undoubtedly working. We have an absolute separation of powers, each and every one of them exercising their activities freely and independently.
Jamil Chade, institutions are working?
It's a good question. I spent the last 3 days with President Temer in Davos, and obviously there was a very clear strategy from the government side to try to depoliticize the issue, because they know that whatever, or they knew even before the decision was taken, that whatever result was coming, it would have a political impact. So what happened was very interesting. Even before the decision was taken, there was basically an order by Temer to his ministers that were with him also in Davos, basically telling the ministers, please do not comment on the decision. Don't celebrate the decision. Don't regret the decision either. So there was a clear strategy to try, first of all, as this intervention from him proved, to try to show to international investors that there's a basically rule of law in Brazil, that there is, as he said, institutions are working. So this is in one side. On the other side, not getting into the debate meant also that he was trying, at least that's what the government is trying to do, is to avoid Lula to use this as a political tool, to avoid creating a victim. So this is a strategy. By no means I'm saying I agree with not, but this is what we saw for the last 3 days in Davos, with a very, very concerted action between Temer himself, but also the ministers who were, in a way, having talks with investors, with us, obviously the press, but having a role to play in the sense of trying to assure to investors, to businessmen, and obviously to leaders in Davos that rule of law in Brazil is working.
I was going to say, Jamil,
it's
was
obviously
Jamil, I was going to say, was he convincing? Was President Temer convincing to his audience? What do they make of what's going on in Brazil right now in Davos?
Well, for business leaders, what we heard, CEOs of many companies, they were asking basically for a continuation of the current economic policy. But all of them, absolutely, everyone we talked to, were saying, well, actually, the elections are still considered as a risk. We don't know what is still going to happen. I spoke to the president of the forum, of the Economic Forum, and he said, yes, it's a question mark. So, yes, investors are looking back to Brazil. The economy presumably will grow 3% this year. That's what the government promises, at least. But at the same time, they're saying, yes, maybe the recession is over. But how will all this play in the political scene? Honestly, I cannot say what will be 2018 in Brazil, but obviously they're all watching the political setting.
All watching it, and when you listened there to Michel Temer, what was your reaction, Luis Felipe de Alan Castro?
I mean, he's in Davos now, and Brazil was very isolated. Everyone tell that. And the only chief of state he thought it was the prime minister of Harare from Lebanon, from the country of his father. He have an important meeting at all. I guess the international community, every international leader had avoided to go to Brazil. They go to Argentina, they go to Colombia, Chile, Uruguay. They just turn around, don't go to Brazil, you and many others. So Brazil is, it's diplomatically, it's on the freeze, for instance.
Yeah, because the scandal that started back in, 2014 now. We're now in 2018, Fernando Santiago, and there's the sense that the whole of the political class in Brazil is tainted.
Yes, and probably it is, because this Operation Car Wash is kind of cleaning up, as its name says, the political practice in Brazil, and they are touching everybody from the right as from the left. And because the left was in power before, and by the way, the law that probably will impeach the fact that Lula can run for president now into this year was promulgated by him in 2010. So he's going to try to contest a law that at the time was made for the guys from the right, so they could not pretend to run for any political courses, maybe. And now he will try a little bit of his own measures that he put back in Brazil. So what I say is that all the political classes from the right or from the left, they are indeed touched by that.
Yeah, and we're going to ask when we come back our panel whether there's light at the end of the tunnel for this investigation and for the various scandals that have unraveled as a result. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
Reporters Plus, presented by Mark Owen.
In northern Iraq, on the Syrian border, Nineveh province is close to the end of the Battle of the Desert. The Shiite elite battalion is on the front line.
مو بس شرط الشيعة أو السنة أو المسيح أو أي إنسان واجب عليه نحمي، أي إنسان الله خلقه بهذه الأرض واجب عليه نحمي، نخليه يعيش بأمان وسلام.
Their goal now is to finish the bitter 3-year war against the Islamic State organization and prepare for the aftermath, which will be no less difficult.
Reporters Plus on France 24 and France24.com.
My name is Jessica Saltz and I'm the Berlin correspondent for France 24. You can find my coverage of German news from here in the capital and beyond on France 24's news programmes and also online at France24.com.
Jessica Saltz, one of the 160 France 24 correspondents around the world. Revisited, presented by Stuart Norval.
On June the 5th, 1967, the Israeli army invaded Egyptian Sinai, unleashing a war that would change the face of the Middle East. During the Six-Day War, Israel took rapid possession of the Golan Heights, the West Bank and the Old City of Jerusalem, holy sites for Jews, Muslims and Christians alike. It's a stranglehold that the Israeli authorities have maintained to this day.
The Temple Mount and the Western Wall will forever remain under Israeli sovereignty.
50 years later, East Jerusalem still symbolizes the ascendancy of Israel, whose settlements policy has created tensions which are as strong today as ever and make the atmosphere in Jerusalem unique in the world.
Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories Laura Cellier is watching for you in the newsroom. She's watching floodwaters, which are continuing to rise. More heavy rain this Thursday. The Paris suburbs particularly hard hit. By its peak on Saturday, the River Seine expected to reach its highest level in the capital since 1982. Jawad takes the stand. Day 2 of the trial of the landlord accused of harboring 2 of the perpetrators of the 2015 Paris attacks. Turkey warns the United States it faces a potential clash if it doesn't drop support for Kurdish YPG fighters. You'll see our report at the border on day 6 of Ankara's offensive in Afrin province in Syria. Donald Trump touching down in Davos. The U.S. president says he's bringing peace and prosperity to the World Economic Forum. Trump meeting with the UK and Israeli prime ministers ahead of his big speech on Friday. Our own Stephen Carroll will have a live update. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. The Workers' Party in Brazil informally endorsing its founder, Lula, to be its candidate next October's presidential election. The answer, if you will, to that court decision on Wednesday lengthening a prison sentence over a corruption conviction. He's got more appeals to come and other court cases as well. With us to talk about it, Luis Felipe de Allen Castro teaches history at the Sao Paulo School of Economics. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to attorney Fernando Santiago. Inti Landaro, former Wall Street Journal correspondent in where? Lima, Mexico City?
And Bogota.
And Bogota, right. And that we're going to be talking in a short while about how this is about a lot more than just Brazil. And with us as well, Jamil Shad. He is in Geneva, correspondent for Brazilian daily newspaper Estado de Sao Paulo and the author of Politics, Bribes, and Football. Welcome back to all of you. Inti Landaro, just for people who don't follow Brazil very closely, the name Lula is associated with those boom years, right, that you had in Brazil, and the country which had this incredible growth. It was the bee and bricks Brazil under him.
He did. The country did very well during the years of he was in power, and the years before with Fernando Henrique Cardoso, and but unfortunately. Reality bit, and what people realized is that at the same time as you had that prosperity, that the country was well managed and the economy was booming, there was some interference between business and politics that was spreading through the Brazilian society.
Jamil Shadi, let me ask you: when things were going well, did you have the sense that Brazil's democracy's arrived? It's now we're on par with other developed nations' democracies.
Well, me personally, I was a little bit skeptical because I don't believe that there are shortcuts for development. It is a long run. Yes, those years were absolutely solid. And they had a very good impact, including in not transforming Brazil into an isolated country, as Professor Allen Castro mentioned, the reality today. So they had a role to play. The question was whether it was sustainable or not, whether this was based on consumption and, for example, exports of commodities or on productivity. So these questions were not touched during those years, and perhaps we didn't use them in the right way. We didn't use those boost years basically to try to transform the country into a more productive place. Now, having said that, it is absolutely true that we have a very different situation today, as Professor Allen Castro said. Just adding to the meeting in Davos, yes, Hariri was with Temer, but there was also another meeting with the president of Angola, and you think, well, maybe there's a cooperation there. No, Angola was asking basically for money because they were cut from the loans of the public bank in Brazil. So it was not actually a positive meeting either. As Professor said, many leaders going to Latin America and skipping Brazil. And here at the UN in Geneva, we see absolutely the same thing. So it is a very difficult and different moment. The question is whether this will, in a way, force the country to a situation where it will have to deal with very structural problems.
And Debbie, let me ask you, you mentioned Angola. Angola and Brazil have something else in common besides being former Portuguese colonies. Both countries have links to this construction company, Odebrecht, which is at the center of it all, it seems. What is it about Odebrecht?
Well, Odebrecht is the company that actually, in a way, forms a pillar of all this scandal. Just for you to have an idea, here in Switzerland, here in Geneva, the Attorney General's office has blocked over 1,000 bank accounts related to the car wash operations. 1,000 bank accounts. The amount of money that has been seized in Switzerland is it goes beyond what Ben Ali, Mubarak, and Libya were seized in Switzerland. So this is the size of the scandal. Now, if you go back to Odebrecht, Odebrecht had as a policy, basically, to go around Latin American, but also African countries, winning huge contracts. In some cases in Angola, Panama, as our friend from the Wall Street Journal knows very well, in Peru, in Colombia, and other places. And the reality was that these contracts were based in a policy of paying bribes, basically. In exchange for that, they got very massive amounts of contracts. This fell apart. But before it fell apart, it was very successful. So successful that Mr. Marcelo Odebrecht, the CEO of Odebrecht, in prison, was at one point the co-president of the World Economic Forum in Davos. So, in a way, it worked for them until the point that actually this all collapsed.
Former co-president of the World Economic Forum in Davos. Let me ask you, Fernando Santiago, the same Marcelo Odebrecht. Right now, he's under house arrest. Right, he's served 10 months in a prison. And the rest of his 10-year sentence is being served out in his luxury mansion in Sao Paulo. Your thoughts on him and the way this is all playing out?
Well, I think it's a big deal in Brazil. It was a new thing, how a guy so powerful that, as Jamil Chad said, was co-president of Davos, could be in jail in Brazil. It was for the first time. Not the only one. I think you know that the Speaker of the House, as was mentioned, and many people here in Brazil are already in jail. And this
and from
is
across the political spectrum.
Yes, from a very large political spectrum.
Mostly Workers' Party's allies.
Well, it depends on who did more bad things than well, not bad things, not the good word. Who was caught and who was not caught. That's the thing to say.
And also who was in power for 12 years.
Yes.
Also, well, yeah, it interferes.
Well, let's say 10.
Inti Landauer, construction companies,
construction companies are involved even in France in bribery. It's kind of it's kind of natural because it's where the state, so through politicians, hire companies to make work.
So what is it about this particular one that makes it different?
What I think, well, even though I don't have any evidence of that, but I think it's a system that was generalized and probably not proper to Odebrecht, that smaller companies were also working that way. Everybody who would get a contract would pay a bribe, a 10% commission, a 10% fee to a local politician. It's kind of the business as usual in Latin America. What I think happened in now is that as the economy is improving, as people have better level of life, they care more about that sort of things than they would before. They care. Corruption is something more serious for them than it was before.
So they care more. So this, in a way, is a good news story.
I guess.
Or a coming-of-age story.
So
I'll put it differently.
It's a coming-of-age story, and I think it is a good story because it's a good news because at the end, the bad guys are punished.
And again,
and you can see it in Peru or in Colombia or in other countries. You have prominent politicians in jail, and you have a will of the people to change the system, and you have at least some politicians hearing it and trying to change things.
There's something that's pretty important as well. As you said, well, this is not new. It started, have been going on for a lot of many years before Lula is starting and get to power. But the thing is, one factor that's not to be neglected is that the new generation of attorneys, public attorneys, and the new generation of judges that are also raised to power in the last 10, 15 years are people that were watching that since they were kids, and they're like tired of this impunity. And what is pretty curious, because people says, okay, justice is not good because there's impunity, and when justice goes on and then convince people, and they said, okay, it's not good because it's selective. That's kind of weird. Well, we don't know where to place ourselves and our hopes.
Yes. Anyhow, and in democracy, in the political system, it depends on elections, and they renew regularly, and the judges depend on their own decisions.
But overall, Luis Felipe de Alencastro, would you say that what's going on now is going to give people faith in their institutions in Brazil, or it's going to make them distrust more
now,
the judiciary and the politicians?
What happens with Temer and with Dilma? Dilma was elected in 2014 with a program who was a leftist program. Temer was his vice president.
Even though he wasn't from the same party. He was from the center-right.
Not the same party.
Yeah.
It's the same collegation. And he gave his endorsement to this program. After, when she's out, she put in work a program who has nothing to do with the people vote for. You see? And so you have 4 elections in Brazil that the Workers' Party won. And so you have people who lost 4 elections who are now pretending to have legitimacy to transform completely Brazil. The security social laws, you see, you have all these transformation on retirement programs and all that in France, but they have dialogue with the trade unions.
So it's more about the policies, not so much about the scandal, is what you're saying.
Yes, they completely turn over the policy.
Very briefly, Inti Landau.
I think it's true. Indeed, Temer is ruling Brazil now in a different way than he was originally elected for. But that doesn't change anything about the corruption of Lula or Dilma or the car wash scandal.
He has a lot of friends in jail too.
Yeah,
Of course. But it's not because these people are it's not because he's in power that these people are innocent. They were clearly convicted.
Right. Getting back to Odebrecht, I want to get back to something that Jamil Shadi said, which is that the kickback schemes run all over Latin America. A former Guatemalan presidential candidate was detained at Miami airport Saturday under an extradition request, and that's just the latest person to fall. We can call up for you the map that shows that really it's everywhere from Mexico and the Dominican Republic all the way down to the bottom of South America, where there are some form or another. This construction company has its fingers in allegedly illicit pies. Jamil Shadi, your thoughts on this?
Well, this is a major story because it actually questions democracy in Latin America. It questions the rule of law. I'm not talking about Lula's trial. I'm talking about the fact that public contracts, politicians, elections, the finance aspect of elections were in a way interfered by a private company. A private company that gained so much space that actually it could basically choose which public works it would do
and do you agree with Inti Landau's
just for you to have an idea.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, just for you to have an idea of the dimension of this, they had a secret computer server here in Geneva where they kept all this information. Actually, a secret one, because it was not in Brazil. It was stored here in Geneva, and just by chance, the same place where they all operated the bank accounts. Not only here, but I've been to Andorra, I've been to Spain, other countries where they actually operated this scheme, and it was highly, highly professional. It was not, well, let's pay this amount to this guy or that amount to that guy. No, they had a regular payment schedule. for politicians
but
all over Latin America and Africa.
Jamil, do you agree with the premise of Inti Landaro that, in fact, Odebrecht is just acting the way all companies acted in the old, under the old practices of all the companies? It's just that this happened to be a bigger and more successful company.
Yes, but with the element of the professional, let's say, management of this payment of bribes. This is what Odebrecht had that the others perhaps did not have in such a sophisticated way. It was so sophisticated that actually Odebrecht was one of the last companies to be caught in the scandal. Many others were caught before Odebrecht. Because why? Because they couldn't trace the entire money track. The way they did was so sophisticated that actually it made it very difficult for the car wash operation to reach them. When they did, what we saw was that in Peru, in Colombia, in Panama, in Brazil, elsewhere, politicians were very much linked to the situation. And there was one element that was very interesting about Odebrecht in these several countries. The payments of bribes had no ideology, had no political party, let's say, tendency. It went to the government. It went to the ones in power, no matter who they were. They wanted the contracts. They wanted the possibility of working there, and they got it.
It's true. In Peru, they basically, as time goes by, you realize that actually all politicians in all elections, both sides of the politicians were taking money from Odebrecht.
I was going to ask you, the Pope mentioned Odebrecht by name during his visit there the past week. He said with scandals tying both the current president, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, and one of his predecessors who we just pardoned, Alberto Fujimori, Pope Francis saying that the company itself is, quote, only a small part of the problem. And he said, what's happening to Peru that when one stops being president, you get imprisoned?
Well, in the case of Fujimori, he has an alibi. He was in jail. But for corruption, so he isn't related directly to the Odebrecht scandal. And I remember Odebrecht entered in Peru after Fujimori had left power.
But what do you think of the Pope's words about this? Saying that he's clearly saying there's something that's fundamentally going wrong in Latin America.
Yes, and I think what is true also. What is true also is that the courts, the prosecutors are working better than they did before.
Jamil Shadeh?
Well, first of all, what the Pope is saying is basically the fact that you have a system. I'm not sure it's over. Actually, I'm quite sure it's not over. You have a system where the private sector and governments, at one point, they are mixed in a very, I would say, negative way for democracy. I'm not talking about Brazil. I'm talking basically about the system that was built in Latin America, where you still have the power being privatized by a group that comes into power. It's our turn now, let's say, in a way. In many countries in Latin America, you see this behavior. As soon as you get into power, there's a chance of, let's say, channeling funds either to your party or to yourself. What we saw here in Switzerland was that Switzerland started to cooperate with many of these Latin American countries, and they found a very similar pattern, and not only related to Odebrecht, but coming back to your other question, to many other companies of other sectors, pointing out to the same direction, which is you can buy basically your influence into the government. And this was very clear in many of the conclusions of the investigations, again, not related to Brazil, but basically to Latin America. Finally, just to complete on the car wash and the entire scandal, it is so big, it is so, the impact is so huge that even here in Switzerland, they are in the third phase of the Lava Jato, of the car wash in Switzerland, which is to investigate their own banks. No, wait a second. Are you saying that this had a complicity with the banks? Obviously, at one point the banks were questioned. But now what happens is the Attorney General of Switzerland is actually going after the banks in Switzerland because of this scandal. Meaning, this is not over. And honestly, I think we're going to have a couple of surprises still on the way.
I get back to the question before we go about whether or not all of this is going to make people more involved in their institutions in Brazil, whether new faces are going to emerge that aren't tainted by these scandals, or whether people will just be turned off by politics.
Yes, you just remember the poll you showed before. The candidate from the center-right, the party of Cardoso, is in third position. So they lost 4 elections, and now that everything should be good to them, they are in third place. So I think they are going to change the political system. They go to walk through a system like a semi-presidential system, like in France, to have just a president elected by the whole country, but the government will be done by the Congress, like as now. That's another problem.
Just very briefly, because we're out of time.
There's a lot of discussion on that, but I don't think that they can, on this scenario right now, change the political system in Brazil. It's to confuse it in order to do so.
Especially we saw with the election coming up in October. Fernando Santiago, I want to thank you. Luis Felipe de Alan Castro, Inti Landara. I want to thank Jamil Shad for joining us from Geneva. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. Brushing up on his Portuguese is James Creedon. How are you?
Not too bad, thanks, Francois. Just a quick look at some of the headlines in the Brazilian press about this, starting with Isto magazine, which is quoting him here last night in Sao Paulo, this quote saying, "It is the people of Brazil who have been sentenced." So they've taken that as their headline. Also in that speech to his supporters, he compared himself to Nelson Mandela, who was in prison before being elected president. Of course, he is still standing for elections this October. And he claimed that there's a pact between the judiciary and the media to get the Workers' Party out of power. So that's their coverage of the initial reaction yesterday. O Globo is looking at the legal options that Lula has, where he will be appealing to 2 courts in Brasilia, I guess the High Court and the Federal High Court, I think the translation would be, and this over the next 2-month period. And these courts will decide if it is a sentence, a suspended sentence, etc. So they're just looking at the legalities, if you like. Meanwhile, CBN Radio has been looking at the market reaction. There was a 3.7-point boost to the markets,
really?
Which CBN Radio is attributing to negative sentiment for Lula, and therefore a positive reaction to bad news for Lula. Meanwhile, Michel Temer, his reaction is being reported by Veja magazine, and he's saying it's nothing to do with Lula at all. It's down to his fantastic speech at Davos, so this is the real reason. He's quoted as saying the courts will judge the matter of Lula in a fully calm and independent manner. So I suppose differing interpretations there of why the market reacted in such a kind of a knee-jerk manner. Yes, yesterday. Just a quick look at how Twitter has been reacting. There were something like 811,000 comments in an 18-hour period on social media. So it really got Twitter users in Brazil reacting in a strong way. And this hashtag for anti-Lula sentiment was sort of gathered together with Lula in prison. And I'm not in a position to be sifting through those tweets, but certainly there was a lot of people getting online and commenting on that. And similarly, where is the proof was the rallying cry on social media for those who contested.
So those 2 hashtags dueling.
Yes. Indeed, exactly. So 811,000 tweets in 18 hours. So lots of reaction online.
All right, many thanks for that, James Creedon. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.